The biggest topic of discussion in the Yu-Gi-Oh community has been on how to attract new players. After Master Duel has struggled to retain new players, and Speed Duel has been a flop, the topic of using a pathway to bridge new players into the game has moved on to changing the game itself to be more understandable and less complex for new players. The current popular solution is keywords. Keywords are a shorthand for common and shared effects, typically used to make cards more readable. Magic the Gathering, Yu-Gi-Oh's biggest competitor, uses keywords for common abilities like flying and trample, as well as for more complex or set-specific mechanics like Foretell and Toxic. Keywords in combination with shorthand prevent cards from looking like this, and instead looking like this. Or in a better example, enable cards to have decent complexity with much less text. Now that brings us to how keywords can look within Yu-Gi-Oh! Before we dive into some fan-made examples of Yu-Gi-Oh! Keywords, let's first look at another fast-paced, yet older game, Force of Will. Here we have two Force of Will cards with some pretty heavy keywording. Lucifer defeated One Ring, and Kaguya, God of Cats in the Moon. Now, I picked these two examples because one of them has the reminder text for comparable mechanics, and the other one is shortened. Look at how long the reminder text is, and just how much a player needs to memorize in order to play a card. This is a bad example of keywording in card games, what ends up being more confusing for new players to learn. Partially because some keywords are complex, but mostly because the keywords in this card are all disparate. Villain is a card type keyword used for deck building and type effects. Flying is a combat focused keyword. Enter is a trigger effect. Quick cast is a method of play. And Revolution would give me an aneurysm to explain here. I brought this example up because Yu-Gi-Oh cards would have to keyword an even larger pool of mechanics with significantly more variations. This gets tricky, because keywords are at their best either when they're simple enough to be understandable, or when they have an easily accessible reference, like in online games. Online games like Magic the Gathering Arena, Hearthstone, and Legends of Runeterra are all great examples of how to use keywords. By hovering over a keyword, it explains what it does, allowing for a player to very quickly understand what it does without needing to open any outside resource other than the card itself. The paper Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG would not have this luxury. So we've seen some bad and good examples of keywords in other games. Now let's look at some Yu-Gi-Oh! Examples of keyworded cards to figure out how they could be applied to Yu-Gi-Oh! These were made by @Frokachu on Twitter. I think all of these are solid, but they do bring up some issues. Zeus, for example, has confusing keywords for new players, and some needless shortening of effects that could create problems. Let's start by explaining the shortening of words on the effects. Instead of saying you can detach 2 materials from this card, it says detach 2. Because there are cards that can detach from other monsters, as well as cards that need to detach specific types of material to activate. It also implies an optional effect, which matters because some cards change depending on how cost is paid. A few changes to how this wording works might solve this, but it turns what should be a simple 6-word reduction of text into a mess of non-specified memorization from players and a massive reduction of important mechanic distinctions. It would still need to add more words to make this card fully usable in Yu-Gi-Oh! Second, shortening rank up on top of an XYZ monster to Turbo is a good idea on paper, but it falls into a few of the same issues despite being a much better idea than shortening. Not all XYZ on top of effects are created equally. Does it keep the materials, and does it count as an XYZ summon? It's quite rare, but not all cards fall into this pattern. Personally, I'm not against using a keyword in this case. Something like once per turn, if an XYZ monster battled this turn, you can rank up by using one XYZ monster you control as material. It still leaves a bit implied, but it's not completely out of the question, in my opinion, if Konami decided to move into this direction here. This brings us to a bigger point about Yu-Gi-Oh! As a whole. Card wording is incredibly specific, and is a key part of the game's interactions, counterplay, and identity. Once per turn, hard once per turn, each effect once per turn, hard each effect once per turn, only one effect per turn, activate only once per turn, you can only gain this effect once per turn, and non-specific activate once per turn are all different effects. A once per turn effect can be used again by another monster if it's negated, a hard once per turn can't. A gain once per turn effect blocks multiple uses even if the card changes names, etc., etc. This extreme variance in card uniqueness conflicts with keywords by nature, since keywords seek to simplify and streamline effects into a consistent mechanic. Without changing the rules of Yu-Gi-Oh! To imply more rules and fundamentals, you can't make keywords work, especially with the over 25 years of non-keyworded card design in the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG. If we can't simplify the fundamental game, the other solution would be to create 1,000 keywords, and you don't want to create a clone of Magic's Morph versus Megamorph versus Manifest versus double-faced cards. There are several pages in MTG's extremely long rulebook for dealing with the stroke-inducing interactions like these. It's certainly not new player friendly, especially in paper. Look, there's a reason modern Morph and Manifest cards are almost always printed with reminder text. There's an even bigger problem following this. Once you simplify Yu-Gi-Oh! Past a certain point, it just stops being Yu-Gi-Oh! It's not completely incompatible, but keywords really wouldn't work well with what Yu-Gi-Oh! Fundamentally is. Modern Yu-Gi-Oh!'s fun comes from the complexity. Here's some examples from current meta decks. When playing against Rescue Ace, you can deny the tag-out effects of Rescue Ace, Airlifter, and Impulse by chain blocking or specifically ordering your card's resolution. This is because the Rescue Ace cards use a win effect trigger and not an if effect trigger. Rika Sun Avalon's gimmick of tributing an opponent's monsters is so unique and powerful because the way Rika Con is worded lets it work with Rika effects that tribute as cost. This lets a player out cards they otherwise couldn't, while also creating a unique immediate threat that an opponent has to proactively deal with. And for a more generic one, infinite impermanence not resolving if the monster that targets is flipped face down before it resolves in chain. The highly specific wordings of Yu-Gi-Oh! Create the counterplay and unique interactions that define modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Simplifying the cards through keywords will not attract new players by itself, and it risks weakening or destroying previous interactions that the game is already built on, which will hurt the game for players who are already invested in the current competitive scene. So if what I've said in this video is the case, is there anything Konami can do to fix Yu-Gi-Oh!'s readability issues and new player issues? Well, I do have a few solutions. Most easily, Konami can adopt the OCG style of bullet pointing separate card effects. Separating card effects into clear, distinct readable sections would dramatically improve reading a card at a glance, as well as player communication about which effect is used. Bit of a tangent here, but if you've ever gotten to a judge ruling at an event, I have seen judges take way too long trying to figure out which specific effect is being used. It takes even the most knowledgeable players time to figure out what's going on with a card, even if it's one they've already seen before. Just fixing the card formatting would do so much to alleviate this problem, and there's no reason for Konami not to implement this change internationally, other than they just hate the TCG. Like, seriously, this wouldn't change anything mechanically, and would just help to make the game better. It doesn't conflict with older versions of cards, and would just be helpful, like the shortening of Graveyard to GY. My next solution is a bit more niche, but I feel like could still be very helpful. Consider releasing cards with larger font sizes, specifically for newer players and players with poor eyesight. I know people with poor eyesight who really struggle to play this game in paper, especially when they're just starting out. Consider, for products like the new 2-player starter set, having some cards with larger text introduce the game for these new players. Maybe also make Yu-Gi-Oh! Neuron faster and more useful in an aiding with accessibility capacity. Lastly, and most importantly, if you want to get players into the game, you need to give them a less complex format that's still competitive and still Yu-Gi-Oh! Older Time Wizard formats are great for this, but are lacking in terms of official support and product releases. Speed Duel and Duel Links were not terrible, but each have problems that kept them from being massive successes. Perhaps a modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Video game with a card pool such as Edison or GOAT format could make an interesting addition. Or you know what? Even easier. Konami could add support for older formats in Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel. It's really hard for me to imagine why they don't. Other than Konami just hates player growth, more money, more literally everything that makes them successful. I don't know how companies can turn down free money. It always boggles me. You know what? I'm going to transition to the outro in the most tacky way possible. In conclusion, card wording in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is often more complex than it needs to be. There's no denying that. But this complexity is what makes Yu-Gi-Oh! Yu-Gi-Oh! Attempting to simplify the game often leaves holes in the game's design and mechanics. Keywording suffers from these issues, but not only that, it often falls into the traps of limiting game design. Cards become mechanically homogenized, which can be better for new players, at the cost of future cards' uniqueness and identity. I have to say that at this point in time, I believe that Yu-Gi-Oh! Has been around for long enough as to prevent any attempts at adding keywords into the game. Konami's best opportunity for adding keywords was with the release of Rush Duels or maybe in Duel Links, games where they already were fundamentally changing Yu-Gi-Oh! Now with these games already released, it gets hard to imagine Konami ever well utilizing keywords for their games. If you've liked this video, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. I've got more content on the way, talking about all sorts of card games. A new Yu-Gi-Oh! Tier list part eventually, it was on the way, I just got sidetracked, as well as some new content for One Piece, and maybe even Magic the Gathering. If you want more content like this, share the video around and subscribe to the channel. Maybe check out some other stuff I've got. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.